Oh my goodness, you really are.
I'm more soft-spoken, so I have my senior historian get everyone's attention. Welcome. I'm the OSD Chief Historian, and on behalf of all the history programs, the services, and the Joint History Office, I welcome you to the January edition of the DoD History Speaker Series. Today, we are joined by Mr. Frank O'Reilly, who has worked as an interpreter and historian at the Fredericksburg National Military Park since 1990. Last month, as you probably know, given this great turnout, marked the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Fredericksburg. And while the battle is remembered for the massacre of Union soldiers at Marye's Heights, Mr. O'Reilly, in his talk, suggests that the fighting between General Stonewall Jackson and Union generals Meade and Gibbon was the battle's most decisive. Mr. O'Reilly's publications include Stonewall Jackson at Fredericksburg and the Fredericksburg Campaign, Winter War on the Rappahannock, which won the 2002 Capital District Book Award, and several other awards. Currently, Mr. O'Reilly is researching the 7 Days campaign and the Battle of Malvern Hill. Just a few reminders before I turn it over to the speaker. We are being televised on the Pentagon channel, so if you'll either remove your badge or just kind of hide it, that would be wonderful. And also make sure your BlackBerry and cell phones are on mute. And a reminder, on February 4th, our next speaker will be Dr. Edward Ayers, who will speak on the Emancipation Proclamation here in the auditorium. Thank you, and I introduce Mr. O'Reilly.
There used to be a picture. There it is. All right. Terrific. Now it's ahead of me. Well, good morning. Good morning. I've spent 25 years working at the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, and as you've heard, written a couple of books on Fredericksburg. I can tell you that doing just a straightforward campaign study makes kind of dry talk, but if ever there was a sympathetic group, I think this would be it. But I want to change it around a little bit. I really want to focus in largely on the things that amazed me about the campaign. But just to back up a little bit, I want to get a sense or a feel from you. How many of you have actually been to the Fredericksburg battlefield? So everybody, just about. How many of you read about Fredericksburg? All right. How many of you heard about Fredericksburg? All right, very good. Fredericksburg is something that really hasn't had a lot of publications until very late in the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century. There were only 2 monograms on it, and then all of a sudden there's an explosion of books that came out just about the same time as I started writing about it. I'm interested to get your perspective. When we look at the Battle of Fredericksburg, I usually ask people all around the country, what would you point out to a visitor if they were coming to see this battlefield for the very first time? And the things that they typically would put out there is that they have to see Marye's Heights and the stone wall. They have to know the story about the futile waves of Union assaults getting dashed apart without even a hope or a glimmer of chance of success, that they never even got to the Confederate line at that point. Some will talk about the river crossings, laying down pontoons, the delay in the pontoons, and how that affects the campaign. But I have been astounded that nobody ever really focuses in on the decisive military action on the battlefield, and that's the southern end of the battlefield. That's an area known as Prospect Hill, where Stonewall Jackson was located. So today, I thought we would just focus in on things that, while we know a lot about it, maybe you haven't considered aspects of it. These are the things I found most revealing. Believe it or not, when I started writing, I had a full head of hair, and I lost it all, and I lost a lot of sleep thinking about Fredericksburg. And those are the things I want to focus in on today. So for one thing, Fredericksburg itself, a fairly insignificant town. It was a colonial port that was no longer a very successful port. The Rappahannock River had silted up. It was no longer really accessible. It had tried to reinvent itself with the railroads, the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, but had not really done a good job of it. By 1860 standards, most of the soldiers who went through there north and south said that it was a vestige of olden times, or an old colonial town that was left untouched, kind of like a 1860s version of colonial Williamsburg to many of them. That's how they looked at it nostalgically. And yet we're going to have two armies that are going to fight over this piece of property in December of 1862 and then linger and stay, which is rather unique in and of itself. Many of the communities of the Civil War, especially in the Eastern Theater, are visited by the war. They have one great white heat moment, and then the armies move on, and people are left to pick up the pieces. But in Fredericksburg, they don't come for a couple of days. They stay off and on for a year and a half. So Fredericksburg is going to be the root of major campaigning in 1862, 1863, and 1864. And it's all because where it's located. Not because of any of its importance in and of itself as a port, but because it's the midpoint between the two opposing capitals. Washington is just 50 miles north, Richmond's just 50 miles south. And if you draw a straight line, and as I-95 does, you're going to wind up in Fredericksburg. To operate in eastern Virginia in 1862 has very limited options. If you go too far to the west, you wind up leaving the Piedmont of Virginia and getting hemmed in by the Blue Ridge Mountains. You go too far east, the tidal rivers become wide and unmanageable, and you're heading towards the Chesapeake Bay. So you really only have about a 45-mile window in breadth to operate in eastern Virginia. And right in the heart of it is Fredericksburg, which is the center of communications, road networks, railroad. So inevitably, the armies are going to show up here. Now, the situation in November of 1862, the Union Army was ostensibly led by a major general named George Brinton McClellan, who had brought his army back, the Army of the Potomac, 135,000, back into Virginia rather reluctantly in October of 1862. He got himself as far as Warrenton, Virginia, and was stalled. At that point, Confederate forces under General Robert E. Lee were able to put a significant force directly in front of him, James Longstreet's corps with Lee in direct command. And then the other half of the Confederate Army under Stonewall Jackson lingered out in the Shenandoah Valley with the ability to slice in behind them and cut their line of communications. If the campaign progressed any further south, the line of communications became longer and more tenuous, and McClellan found himself literally paralyzed by this situation that you're looking at. When we think about Fredericksburg as an antidote to this, the person who seemed to be most fixated on it was this gentleman, Major General Ambrose Everett Burnside. Burnside had thought about Fredericksburg even before he commanded this army. If we take him at his own word. He said at one point he went to see McClellan and told him that if he meant to go to Richmond this winter, he must go by way of Fredericksburg, which is located over here. His argument was that they're living on a single-track railroad called the Orange and Alexandria Railroad for all of their supplies. It has several critical limitations to it in November of 1862. Number one, it can bring 700 to 900 tons of supplies to the Army daily. Impressive in its own right. until you consider that the Army had a daily minimum requirement of about 1,500 tons to function. So it was only getting half the supplies it needs. And that answers one of the big conundrums of 1862, where George McClellan keeps insisting he cannot go forward because he's not getting supplies, and Lincoln constantly harrying him, saying he must go forward because he's sending him all those supplies. And the truth is, they're both right. While the supplies are being sent, they still have to go through this choke point of the Orange and Alexandria Railroad and are not arriving at the other end except as a trickle. And so there's a fundamental breakdown in communication and understanding with this one. The second big problem with the Orange and Alexandria, it doesn't go where the Army wants to go. It heads southwest, not towards Richmond, but away from Richmond. The further you go down the Orange and Alexandria, the more difficult it is to protect, the harder it is to keep supplies coming, and ultimately, it doesn't go where you want to go. But there is another railroad here, and it runs from the Potomac River down to Fredericksburg and on towards Richmond. Its name in reverse, the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. So even the Federal High Command can figure out it goes where they want to go. It was shorter, it could handle the tonnage, it went where they wanted. It was an ideal. So Burnside is not a bad strategist. We're actually an operational leader here. But in truth, George McClellan already had come to the same conclusion himself. And he demonstrated that because on his last day of command for the Army of the Potomac, he did two things. Number one, he ordered a pontoon bridge train on November 6th to be massed in Washington to be sent to Fredericksburg so that he could cross the Rappahannock River without missing a beat. The second thing he did is sent Union cavalry to reconnoiter Fredericksburg to see if it was heavily defended and whether it could be easily seized. A small group under a captain named Ulrich Dahlgren, son of a very famous admiral of that time, took a small pickup group of cavalry. They dashed into Fredericksburg in rather cowboy-esque style. They literally charged down the main street and shot it up and turned around and charged right back out. What they realized is they had no resistance. There were only about 800 Confederates anywhere near the city of Fredericksburg, so it was wide open. Curiously, when Ulrich Dahlgren got back to camp, the person he was reporting to was not McClellan. He was reporting to McClellan's replacement, Ambrose Burnside. Burnside had been placed in command because he was not George McClellan. McClellan was cautious, he was conservative. Burnside was aggressive, assertive, decisive, and was hand-selected by the president to lead the largest, most prestigious army of the Republic. But there was a particular reason why he was placed in command when he was. The order that put him in command has a second paragraph that says, now that you command the largest, most prestigious army of the Republic, what are you going to do with it? It required action. It demanded action. And Burnside answered immediately. He said, I propose to take the army to Fredericksburg. Use that as a springboard on a drive south to capture Richmond, relying on speed and surprise to seize this and use it as a base before the Confederates could interdict him and stop him. Now, it's not a bad idea. In fact, he even requested pontoon bridges to go along with this, reiterating what McClellan had said. But the part that made me lose hair was actually trying to figure out exactly who's responsible for focusing and fixating on Fredericksburg. Is this really Burnside's idea from day one? Or is this something that he inherited from McClellan and is just going along with it? Or is this a confab of the two minds? One of the things that muddies the issue for me is one of Burnside's staff officers, a man named David Larned. He's an aide. He writes most of the sensitive correspondence for General Burnside. For example, he writes to Mrs. Burnside when the general's too busy to do it himself. At this particular time, Burnside was very busy, having just inherited the Army of the Potomac. And Larned wrote to Mrs. Burnside to tell him. But he added something rather peculiar. He said that her husband had inherited a campaign planned and begun by another and not carried on as he would have had he begun it himself. So whose idea is Fredericksburg at this particular point? Maybe it is a little bit of Burnside, but it's an awful lot of momentum that's already been created by the movements of McClellan. So the Army was inevitably going to go to Fredericksburg, whether it was Burnside's or McClellan's. The only thing we can say in behalf of General Burnside is it's going to get there a lot faster under him. Now, given this circumstance, this situation, Abraham Lincoln didn't like it. He was becoming very much an interactive commander-in-chief in the fall of 1862. He was taking a direct interest in all of his field armies at that particular time. But there's only one that he interfered with directly, and that was the Army of the Potomac. Burnside should have guessed that he had the ire of the president when the brand new General-in-Chief of the Army, Henry W. Halleck, the mouthpiece and voice of the president for the Army, immediately telegraphed Burnside and said, "I don't think the president likes the plan. I am coming down to meet you at once." That is a red flag. Halleck doesn't leave Washington to go see field commanders. But here he does instantly. He raced down to Warrenton. They had a 2-day conference on November 11th and 12th in which Halleck brought a number of officers to help make his case to stay the course and go straight down the Orange and Alexandria, because what he was looking at and what the president was looking at is that the Confederates were divided, and the Federals, with interior lines, could strike at one before it could be reinforced. He didn't like the idea of them going around Longstreet and Lee when they could demolish Longstreet and Lee. He wanted a decisive action in the Piedmont of Virginia. Burnside brought a number of officers to the conference as well to make the point that Lee and Longstreet would never allow themselves to be baited into a major battle before they could concentrate. And if anything, they would bait the Federals and divert them off towards the Blue Ridge Mountains in an insignificant direction. And they would let the Confederates dictate the where, the when, and the how. As they went back and forth, the most curious part of this entire conference is that Halleck didn't do his homework. And he brought the one person with him that was guaranteed to make Burnside's case irrefutable. He brought the chief of the U.S. military railroads with him, a man named Herman Haupt. And Haupt talked about all the things we've just talked about and then added a couple of his own. He said that security on the railroad of the Orange and Alexandria was too difficult because not only was it susceptible to Stonewall Jackson's attack, but it was also an area that was becoming increasingly active with irregulars, guerrillas, partisans. In fact, John Singleton Mosby is only a couple of months away from creating his own little confederacy there. So he's already been able to tag that or identify that. But the surprising one, even for me, was that the number one problem with the Orange and Alexandria Railroad and security wasn't the Confederates or the irregulars. It was the Union Army itself. According to Herman Haupt, that railroad was paralyzed numerous times during this operation by Union soldiers stealing all of his wood piles and bathing in all of his water sources. And he flat out declared during this that more than once, my trains have been stopped dead by foaming, soapy boilers. And he's the one who targeted the RF&P Railroad at Fredericksburg being ideal. It could handle the tonnage. It was short. It was easily protected. It was easily guarded against Stonewall Jackson, against partisans, and against bathers. So he's the one who made the case that Fredericksburg is the logical place to go. Halleck brought the swing vote with him. And at that point, he went back to the president to talk about the plans. Abraham Lincoln changed his mind. The man who didn't want to go to Fredericksburg now is going to give his blessing directly to Burnside, with the caveat that the president thinks it will work if pressed quickly, otherwise not. Speed is essential. Why would the president say that to Ambrose Burnside, if pressed quickly? Who was the previous commander of this army? George McClellan, notoriously slow. Who created the culture in the Army of the Potomac? George McClellan. And who was his greatest friend in the Army of the Potomac? Ambrose Burnside. So who